Today we will be covering Chapter 2, Developing Academic Language from the Language-Rich Classroom Text. My name is Allie Belden, and I will be the facilitator. First, we will cover what is academic language. We will also cover the obstacles that get in the way of making sure that academic language is used with our ESOL students. Then we will talk about acquiring academic language and strategies in order to use this language for our students. Finally, we will end with the CHATS acronym and a Padlet activity that is based on the reading from this week. First, we'll talk about what academic language is. The text refers to this language as being cognitively demanding, undemanding, content embedded, and context reduced. When it's demanding, that's when a student would be taking an exam. So something that's going to be strenuous and they're going to be using a lot of vocabulary. It's high stakes and they will be using that higher level vocabulary. Cognitively undemanding language would be like if students were talking to their friends and vocabulary would make sense to them because they're using it with people that they know, friends, family, and peers at school. Content-embedded academic language is vocabulary that is used in context. So if a student is going to adopt a dog at the pound, they will be more likely to understand what the pound means based on the context that they're in. They can use context clues, they can see content embedded in the situation, and will be more likely to understand the vocabulary. Then there's context reduced, and this is when there's vocabulary that is higher level, that could be in like a scholarly article that normally people don't talk as long, and it's in a few sentences, but they have really rich vocabulary, so it may be hard to read at first. I found this video online that also talks about what academic language is, and I found that it's very useful, so check this out really quick.
It's very important for ESL students to be exposed to all different elements of a vocabulary word, and this comes from Scarcella's academic language, which is the big jump and the big hurdle for our ESL students. We have to get them speaking and listening and reading and writing in this academic language, being exposed to different, every component, sociolinguistic, the lexical component, everything. So when I tried to break up words, I tried to make them understand the words. So legislation, legislate, legislated. I would go even further into that in regards to time. I didn't do that today, but most of the time when I'm talking about vocabulary, I really try to expose them to every different component. And by the time we're just done discussing, like, okay, I'm done. I got the word. So I think that's really crucial. And it was one thing I really learned in grad school that I constantly reference all the time. It was probably my favorite research project that I read.
So like this teacher was saying, just to reiterate the content and to use those synonymous words that she was using in the class, that will help with our academic language with our ESOL students. So let's talk about more what the text defined academic language as. In the text, it referred to it as the language of books. So in a cognitively demanding, context-reduced, age-appropriate activity, students are able to participate, they can comprehend, and they can communicate. If they can do all three of those things in that environment, then they can use academic language. It also talked about vocabulary and grammatical nuances. So for the vocabulary that's used with ESOL students, there can be content-specific vocabulary and non-content specific vocabulary. And this was something that I found extremely interesting from the text, because most of the time I feel like I have to teach the content-specific vocabulary for my students when sometimes they might actually need the non-content specific vocab. So when you're defining things like government or parallelogram, content-specific vocabulary, we can find something that equates to that vocab in their language. But when we're talking about non-content specific vocabulary, like the words determine or despite, and the text says these are the words that are the in-between words, most of the time ESOL students are trying to define those words that they're struggling with reading comprehension. So you need to focus on non-content specific vocabulary with ESOL students just as much as you're focusing on content specific vocabulary. That is a huge obstacle that comes to learning academic language for ESOL students, but also is grammatical nuances. Fang 2008 is quoted in the text, and it talks about 4 limitations for ESOL students when they're trying to learn academic language: the technicality, the abstraction, density, and the authoritativeness. The technicality is when students find words that take on different meanings in different contexts. So like the word bear and bear. You can say them the same way, but they also have different meanings based on which word you're using. Abstraction is when you're using nouns and then turning them into words that have different endings. So for example, the text used trap, and then later in the sentence, it turned it into trappings, but it was referring to the same definition. And a lot of ESOL students get hung up on that transition. There's also density that gets in the way. That's when a lot of info is in small, complex words. Those larger vocabulary sometimes are harder to break down, especially when it's a few and there's not a lot of words that they can pull out for context. And then the authoritativeness is when there's impersonal, formal language. So you're speaking from a very formal perspective. You're not saying it in your own words, and it's very academic, and there's nothing that a student can pull out. It's all academic and very strenuous for the student to understand. Another video of a teacher who was describing these non-content specific words just reiterates how important it is to teach our students so that they know this vocabulary.
It's also important to teach academic vocabulary very vigorously. And here we want to use somebody's system. So Elfrida Hebert has a system called Word Zone Words, the first 4,000 words that make up the bulk of English text, especially academic text. D. Gardner has a list called Academic Vocabulary List, another 4,000 word list. But they have like the smaller numbers. The first 1,000 words make up like 80 to 85% of text. I want to be after those words, and I want to be progress monitoring to say, how many of those words does my learner know? Because I know the more of those words they know, the less they're struggling to get through text, the more that they're just reading automatically, and then they can concentrate on the other key words that are more thematically related. But I want them to be reading a lot, and I want them to be applying strategies, and I want to be teaching, like widening their vocabulary, because comprehension rests on the words that they recognize. And when they read text that is very dense with words they don't know, they can't get any comprehension. So we have to be text analyzers. We have to look at our text and go, for Carlos, how many of these words will Carlos know going in? And I can't teach them all. So I have to decide, well, what are the most important words to front load? And then what am I going to teach Carlos to do to get around all those other words he's going to bump into that he doesn't know? So being strategic is really, really important.
So she's reiterating those words, those in-between words that are recommended for students to learn really help with reading comprehension. And that's what's so big with our ESOL students that we want to make sure that we're doing. Another obstacle to learning academic language is lack of exposure. So instruction that lacks the use of academic language, this is saying that teachers sometimes aren't using academic language that our ESOL students need desperately. There could be no reading experiences at home or at school. Some schools don't give time for students to read, and with the expectation that students are reading at home, and some homes have no reading experiences for students. And I find that, no experiences means no academic language. If they don't have the experience, the exposure to academic language, how are we to assume that they will learn this effectively? So how can we acquire academic language based on these obstacles? Some of the most effective methods from the text said family read-alouds are so important, so that parents support. If we can get parents to be reading at home, engaging students, then we can allow more time for those students to read. Also, with equity, it's important to remind that some families might not be able to read at home, so giving that time during school, we should think about giving more time for students to read, just because we shouldn't expect that every household is reading at home. We want to make sure that our classrooms are equitable and that all students have the chance to improve on reading comprehension. The ultimate goal with acquiring academic language is for our ESL students is to transfer that peripheral vocabulary and to turn it into active vocabulary. Peripheral vocabulary is when ESOL students have a general understanding of what the word means. They've heard their friends say it. They can identify the word when it's in context, but they aren't actively using it. They're not saying it in language. They're not writing it. So we want to transfer that peripheral vocabulary, those outside words, and make sure that we're turning it into active vocabulary for our students. We need to also increase exposure to academic language. Like I said earlier, there's a lack of exposure in the classroom and maybe at home. So ways to increase exposure is to listen to audiobooks. This helps support ESOL students so much because they might have low reading comprehension. So if they have a read aloud that they can audibly use whenever they want, then someone can be reading to them as they're following along. Most of those students also might be spending more time on trying to vocalize the word that they're not even understanding what the word is saying. So audiobooks are really helpful for our ESOL students. And the resource that they gave in the book, actually, they gave us a resource called storylineonline.net. And these are tons of audiobooks that students can read for free. So I highly recommend checking this resource out. It has, a lot of different diverse stories that your students can use that can be more relevant. And I really love this resource. I think this is a great part to include in that text, and will ultimately increase that exposure that we're trying to find. Also, appreciate the power of the home language. I've heard many teachers say before, don't speak in that language, you're speaking in English here, and we need to work on your English. And that's not the right way to go. Research does not support students avoiding the use of their home languages. You just don't see it. The linguistic interdependence principle reiterates this concept that it basically says, and this is Cummins, by the way, but it basically says that the stronger their home language is, the more likely they're going to be able to be confident in another language. So that bilingual principle, if you're good in your home language, you're more than likely to learn a second language just as strong. So there's no research that shows they should stop speaking in their home language. It actually helps them a lot. A resource that was recommended also in the text was Reading A to Z. And I took this from their website. It says compared to accelerated reader like AR, some people refer to it as AR, Study Island, Scholastic, Reading AZ is used by 16% of teachers. So this is a really fantastic teacher resource. When you click on the link, you're going to be taken to their website, their platform. You can get free samples of text. And I like this because they include text also in Spanish. So it's not just in English. You can see it up here. It'll say science, writing, vocabulary, and it'll be in other languages, not just English. So I really like this resource as well. Finally, incorporating relevance and authenticity. I think this is really important for ESOL students and for our other students. Is it relevant and authentic to our students? They are more likely to learn if it is relevant to them, if it matters to them, and if it's authentic in the environment. So they need to know the why and the want. If they know the why, then they're going to want to learn. We need to increase motivation this way, engagement, and you're more likely to read a text if you're interested to see what it's about. And this can apply to our lives as well, that we normally read text that's relevant and authentic to our lives. At the end of the chapter, it explains the CHATS model, but I won't go into it too much just because I saw that this is explained in Chapter 3, and the Chapter 3 facilitator has to talk a lot about this, so I won't go too in-depth into what each one means. C means content reading strategies. H is opportunities for higher order thinking. A is assessment that is in the hands of the teacher. T is total participation techniques. And then C is scaffolded instruction. So all of these will be strategies to help us with our ESOL students. For today's activity for participation credit, you will click on the Padlet link below and answer the questions on the interactive board. You can either click on this link here, or you can scan the QR code and it will take you to the Padlet. Once you get to the Padlet activity, you can press play on the directions and you can read through each one of the questions. What is academic language? What is the difference between cognitively demanding and cognitively undemanding language? What are some obstacles for learning academic language? What are ways to increase exposure to academic language? To write your comment, you'll click right below. And as you type your comment or your answer, make sure your name is included in your answer so people know that you've answered. So Dr. Pettit can go back and give you that credit.